folks. I've got Arash Darius Kamali with me for a conversation that's been a long time coming. Darius is a feature animation, television, and documentary producer and member of the Producers Guild of America. He's a former visual analyst and archive curator with the State Department-supported International Monitor Institute. Darius is also the author of 3 books of philosophical poetry, which are all linked in the description to this video. Also in the description is a link to his podcast, The Persian Version. Darius also created a Facebook page that used to be called The Persian Version, but has since been renamed Ariana, and is devoted to Iranian civilization and the culture of the wider Persianate world. It's great to have you on, Darius.
Jason, it's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. I've been I'll have to tell the audience, a fan of yours for a couple of years now, ever since I began watching your YouTube videos and became familiar with your work. And have bought a couple of your books as well. I look forward to reading all of them soon. Let me say that, despite some potential political differences or philosophical differences that are bound to exist between anyone, that we can probably explore in other conversations in the future, I think we have a number of real deep commonalities as well. And those include what you would call, based on your philosophical movement and treatise of blanking out on the name now, Prometheism. Prometheism. I noticed the pun there, which is something that I have always identified with, in the sense that I've always believed, my worldview has always been that mankind is nature having become conscious of itself. And therefore, from a certain point onward, I've always thought that it's not only likely, but it's desirable that consciousness will direct the course of its own evolution going forward. And I think that thought is not very dissimilar, if not identical, at least similar enough to your own vision of Prometheism. And of course, when it comes to Ironica, we have quite a lot in common. And I think the most basic fundamental similarity is the idea that Iran is not a country, which is something I've heard you say multiple times, and that it's not even a nation state with which used to have an empire or empires, that it's more a civilization in a Toynbean sense, correct? A civilizational sphere comparable to what the West would be. And so that in and of itself, I think, puts us in a in a minority in terms of the number of people who are aware of this. Yeah, certainly in the West. I know some Iranians are aware of this, some Iranians themselves are not aware of this. But I think that in itself really attracted me to your philosophy. And I was hoping that sooner or later we'd be able to get together and speak.
Likewise, Darius. And, I think that this moment is, as good as any, since Iran really needs, all the help that it can get on a philosophical, spiritual level in order to try to give some kind of deeper guidance to the revolutionary forces that are at play here and that are unfolding, in front of our eyes right now.
Yeah, for sure. No, Jason, I like so many of us, I don't have to tell our fellow Iranian diaspora community that we've all been affected almost universally in a negative way by the '79 revolution. I was born in Iran, and we were here when that happened, and it has affected us in just such enormous and deep ways, and that doesn't need to be explained to anyone in our community, for sure. And I remember there have been times in the past, and the Green movement protests in 2009, where we thought something is happening, and each time it doesn't quite get there. But I do actually really feel that this is a turning point, and I don't know, I have no idea what date. I can't give a month or a day or a week or even a year when this regime will fall. But I do feel that when you have a situation where a majority of the population, possibly a large majority, but certainly a majority of the population, does not believe in the system, and according to some recent polls, doesn't even identify with Islam, that's certainly not a sustainable situation. And so now the question is, what direction does it go? And my hope is that this regime can be replaced without the dismemberment of Iran, without colonization, without war, without civil war. And so any thoughts toward that end, I'm willing to participate in and lend my support to.
You mentioned the Green Movement, Darius, and so, although we're going to have a conversation with a very broad historical scope, I thought it would be good to start just by mentioning the fact that we're recording this on February 7th, and within the last 72 hours or so, over the course of the last 3 days, there have been two statements put out by the leaders of the Green Movement, by the two most prominent reformist politicians, one being Mir Hossein Mousavi, who was, of course, the figurehead of the Green Uprising in 2009, and the other by Mohammad Khatami. Khatami's declaration followed Mousavi's by about 24 hours. And these two declarations were endorsed by 7 of the most prominent political prisoners in the country, including Fawzeh Rafsanjani, the daughter of former President Hashemi Rafsanjani, who's a political prisoner as well. And so look, these people, Mousavi and Khatami, and also Fawzeh Rafsanjani, I mean, some people believe that she could potentially have become the first female president of the Islamic Republic. That idea was floated for some time. And certainly it's what Rafsanjani was pushing for before he died. In any case, these are, the most prominent former voices for reform of the existing system. And they both came out and said, this regime has proven irreformable, and the protesters in the street are right to demand a new constitution. And there needs to be some kind of a referendum and the process for basically transition to a new system based on a fundamentally rewritten constitution. And so, look, that really represents a turning point. Okay, when people of the like of Khatami and Mousavi have themselves reached the conclusion that this regime is irreformable, clearly they've taken the barometer of the vast majority of the population, and I think that at this point they are beginning to consider their own political future, that they want to get off of this inevitably sinking ship and perhaps carve out a place for themselves as figures in a minority light Islamic Democrat party in the context of some new Republican system in Iran. And they know that if they wait much longer than this, they're going to be, tarred and feathered with the rest of the regime officials. So, that to me is very significant. And I think that, there are a lot of people, both, of course, there are people in the regime who are very dismissive of this and say, well, these people are traitors, they're connected to foreign interests, the Green Movement was a George Soros color revolution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But number one, who in the Islamic Republic isn't connected to foreign interests? I mean, Ali Larijani, has his own mafia. Who anywhere, right? Yeah. That's number one. And number two, there are people who in the opposition abroad, particularly in the opposition abroad, think that these kinds of statements from Mousavi and Khatami are irrelevant because it's been a long time since people have given up on reform. And, who are these people anyway to insert themselves into the debate over what kind of regime should take shape now? And I think that those people are incredibly politically naive. First of all, it was only a few years ago when, people put their finger in the blue ink to go vote en masse for Rouhani's government. That was yet another good faith attempt at reforming this system after they had already seen what happened both with Khatami earlier on in the 2000s and then with Mousavi in 2009 to 2010. People were still willing to give another chance to reform. Only a few years ago, when the Rouhani administration came to power, the administration that included Javad Zarif, who signed this nuclear agreement. And so the truth is, as bitter as a pill it is for many to swallow, that it's only very recently that people have fundamentally given up on reform. And those in the opposition who disregard the significance of these statements also disregard the fact that we're talking about people who were founders of the Islamic Republic. Mir Hossein Mousavi was prime minister under Ayatollah Khomeini. He was prime minister during the most formative years of the Islamic Republic. These are key elements from, Hashemi Rafsanjani's daughter. I mean, Hashemi Rafsanjani, after Khomeini and Khamenei, probably Rafsanjani was the most significant figure in the power structure of the Islamic Republic for decades. So we're talking about the inner circle of the Islamic Republic beginning to disintegrate and turn on itself. And that is a tremendously significant development.
No, listen, I am actually slightly surprised to hear you put it that way, because I wasn't sure if you were a believer in the possibility of still some sort of reform or not. And I'm not sure where you are even at this point. But listen, my contention is that what is the alternative, right? So everyone agrees that the regime as it exists is not tolerable, either from an economic perspective, its foreign policy, what it's doing to the people. It's just a regressive system that's full of corruption, very mafia-esque in a sense, so on and so forth. That doesn't really need to be said. I think everyone, at least in the diaspora, is aware of that. But what's the route forward? And yeah, I am not surprised to hear the likes of Mousavi, and who was the other one, Karoubi, during that time, who was also
Mohammad Khatami.
No, yes, Khatami for sure. I'm not surprised that those guys, although it's good to hear that, because they were the reform movement, and for them to say that the reform movement is dead is quite interesting. It's even more interesting to me to hear the likes of Ahmadinejad talking against the system now. I almost don't know what to say about that. But
so look, you see, it's coming apart from both directions. It's both from the quote, left and right don't really apply in a Western sense.
They don't apply, no. Well, look, Jason, they don't even apply here anymore. That's
true. But point being, the system is coming apart at the seams from both of its polarities. These are opposite polarities, Ahmadinejad versus, say, Khatami. And they're both now breaking from the system. And this is a process of implosion. So that no one has any confusion, I'm not in any way advocating reform or anything. My point is that the former leaders of the reform movement are no longer advocating reform. Their message is now a message of revolution, except that they'd like it to take place in an orderly fashion. And of course, they're trying to save their own skins. But this is important because a lot of people in even SEPA, in the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, listen to the likes of Mir Hossein Mousavi. So in terms of avoiding a bloodbath and attempting to have a revolution that proceeds with some kind of orderly transition, it's a significant move that's taken place.
Yeah, but you mentioned to save their own skins, Jason. I would say let them save their own skins if in the process it also saves Iran's skin.
Right.
Now that's a big if, I understand, but
right. Yeah. So look, one of the things that, and I hear, I want to try to move toward, the heart of the matter that we have in view to discuss. And one of the things that Mousavi said in his recent declaration has some bearing on that, and that's that he said, look, when the new constitution is written, the one that replaces the Islamic Republic's constitution, we have to make sure that it's a constitution that won't be irrelevant again in 40 years, the way that the constitution we drafted for the Islamic Republic is now no longer consonant with the, attitudes, worldview, aspiration of the population. And so this brings us to the question of, changes in constitutional order in the history of Iran and how revolutions have reshaped Iranian sociopolitics. So part of the message of reform, the message of Mousavi, what Khatami kept beating the drum about back during his 2 terms of presidency, was rule of law, rule of law, rule of law, and so, this whole emphasis on qanun and, an attack on lawlessness and basically like mafioso behavior and vigilantism, which you see from the Basij, from the Islamic militias, and from all kinds of sort of extra-governmental entities that still are part of the ruling apparatus of the Islamic Republic. This is a part of the reform movement, maybe the core of the reform movement, that reaches all the way back through revolutionary aspirations in Iran throughout the 20th century. And so, for example, it has been pointed out by quite a number of analysts that Mohammad Mossadegh, who was elected, prime minister in 1951, was attempting to basically execute the constitution as it had been framed by the earlier Persian constitutional revolution. He was a prime minister who was trying to execute the full range of authority delegated to a prime minister within the context of a constitutional monarchy, except that the Pahlavi regime by that time had already deviated from constitutional monarchy into a much more authoritarian, autocratic style of governance. And ultimately, this resulted in Mossadegh, who had the will of the people, the majority of people behind him, being able to drive the Shah out of Iran between 1951 and 1953, basically exiling the Shah, effectively forcing the Shah to go into a self-exile, to flee to Italy. And in those years of 1951 to 1953, Prime Minister Mossadegh took the first steps toward reframing Iran as a secular republic. And of course, what that meant was a freedom of political parties. And, this was the beginning of the Cold War. This was a period where, the Western establishment was terrified of Stalin, their former ally in the Second World War. They were looking at Soviet ambitions in all kinds of areas, not just Eastern Europe, but Central Asia. And they were very worried that the most organized political party in Mossadegh's democratic Iran was the Tudeh party, the Iranian Communist Party. And so as part of allowing a kind of democratic free-for-all and, legitimate parliamentary representative government, they would have to tolerate Mossadegh giving full freedom of political participation to parties such as Tudeh. And, they were worried that this would lead ultimately to an electoral takeover of communists in Iran.
Although of course, Mossadegh himself was very far from a communist. I believe he was an aristocratic landowner from that sort of a family, was he not?
Absolutely. He was. Now, it's interesting. Not only was he an aristocrat from one of the Qajar clans, he actually was elected to the first Majlis, to the first parliament of Iran formed in the Persian Constitutional Revolution, which I want to come to momentarily. But when Iran had its first parliament set up and its first constitution framed, Mossadegh, as a very young man, was elected, but he wasn't allowed to serve because he didn't meet the minimum age.
That's right.
So this is a guy, he has a history going all the way back to the beginning of constitutionalism in Iran. And he tried to insist on, the implementation of a parliamentary constitution. So this experiment between 51 and 53 ends with, the infamous Operation Ajax. CIA MI6 coup against Mossadegh, where the Shah was brought back in in an operation led by Fazlullah Zahedi, General Zahedi, who was a very far right-wing sort of nationalist figure, actually was connected to Nazi sympathizers in late 1940s Iran. In any case, Zahedi and his associates brought the Shah back into power, and Mossadegh was put under house arrest. So, by the way, I mean, when they not to say Mousavi is a Mossadegh, but when they put Mousavi under house arrest, there is a kind of historical echo with
For
Muhammad.
sure. Yeah. Well, the joke is that, you know, a larger percentage of Iranian former leaders are either exiled or killed or in prison than anything else, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
The next move after becoming president or prime minister or Shah or leader of any kind is jail.
Well, exactly, exactly. And so when the Shah came back into power, he basically banned almost all party politics. He reduced participation in Majlis to a choice between two parties. One was his own, Hezb Rastakhiz, and the other one was Hezb Pan-Iranist. The Pan-Iranist party was tolerated as a quote-unquote loyal opposition to the Shah's party. And by the way, a lot of the really, like bright ideas that the Shah took credit for later, like the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire, those were ideas that came out of the Pan-Iranist party.
Wow.
And the Pan-Iranist party, for example, I mean, when you talk about loyal opposition, they opposed, for example, the Shah giving up Iran's claim to Bahrain in 1971, allowing the 14th state of Iran, Bahrain, to declare independence. That was vociferously opposed in the Majlis, in the parliament, by the Pan-Iranist party.
Yeah, interesting. Kermit Roosevelt, of course, wasn't involved with all that, as you know. What are your thoughts before we move further back, maybe to the constitutional revolution? What are your thoughts about whether it was actually, certainly the CIA was involved and they wanted to be involved, but the question has always been, how effective were they? That were it not, for example, I'm just playing devil's advocate here, were it not for the fact that a large percentage of the population did want the Shah back, that they couldn't possibly have orchestrated this coup. And in fact, if you look at the details, I've read that their original coup attempt failed, and then there was a second one, which was not orchestrated by them. I'm not sure how much of that is true or if we'll ever know. But what are your thoughts on that?
This is such a rabbit hole to go down. Like, yeah. It would require probably a whole program in and of itself. So I'll give you the real Cliff's Notes version of it right now, and then maybe we can revisit it in a subsequent conversation. But okay, very, very long story short, I think that after the end of the Second World War, a large number of former Nazi military intelligence people were incorporated both into CIA. Actually, they formed CIA. CIA formed through a fusion of the Galen organization.
Paperclip, yeah?
Yeah, well, it was associated with it. The way the paperclip happened was that the OSS, the American military intelligence, was fused with Nazi General Reinhard Galen's Eastern European Intelligence Network to create the Central Intelligence Agency, which was, in other words, half constituted by Nazis. And then this new quasi-Nazi institution, namely the CIA, ran Operation Paperclip to bring in all these Nazi scientists. And something similar happened in Britain, not to the same extent, but there were always British sympathizers of the Nazis in London. There were people who had wanted to make a treaty with Hitler during the Second World War. And so there were rogue elements in MI6 that were very far right wing. And in Iran, in the late 1940s, after the Second World War, you have the Soviets stay in Azerbaijan. They refused to leave Azerbaijan. They occupied Iranian Azerbaijan and tried to amalgamate it to their Republic of Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
And
the Republic of Baku, yeah.
Yeah, the Republic of Baku. And they had also set up a secessionist Kurdistan, which was Soviet. And so there were these right-wing groups. There were always sympathizers of Hitler and Nazi Germany in Iran during and leading up to the Second World War. And once Iran's territorial integrity was in question, there were these right-wing groups who started working together with elements of MI6 and CIA, who I think were responsible for seeing through that coup after its initial failure. So when you talk about like the coup, you know, there was a second coup attempt after the initial plan by Kermit Roosevelt failed. I think that General Zahedi was working with certain right-wing groups, particularly people a part of an organization called SUMKA, the Socialist Organization of Iran, National Socialist Party of Iran.
Yeah.
And so they're the ones who basically saw through this coup in a much more ragged, mercenary fashion after the initial op planned by MI6 and CIA fell apart. Anyway, that's a deep rabbit hole.
Sure.
But you know, the real relevance here in terms of you know, the implication of your question, namely CIA regime change efforts, this being the first one of them, the first major one.
That's right. That's right.
The paradigm setter for all the rest of them.
That's right.
So the implication in your question of blowback, right, and to what extent was this successful? What were the ramifications of it? I think the really significant thing here is that when the Shah comes back in, he creates an autocratic system with only two parties, and the other party besides his own is this sort of, you know, how do you put it, loyal opposition, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
good cop, bad cop.
Good cop, bad cop. And so we have all these Iranian parties that are marginalized, including the National Front of Mohammad Mossadegh, Cephe Milli, of course, all the communist parties, you know, Tudeh, Fadayan Khalq, later Mujahideen Khalq. These parties are all declared illegal. And the ultimate consequence of this, namely the consequence of suppressing a parliamentary system, of basically abrogating the constitution of Iran in the direction of autocracy, was that all of these banned political parties wound up getting behind Ayatollah Khomeini and the conservative clerical establishment in 1978-79, because the mosques were considered untouchable.
That's
and
right.
Even the Shah did not want to execute Khomeini. The Shah had repeated opportunities to execute Khomeini. Instead, he put him in exile. He put him in exile in the holiest Shiite city in Iraq.
Yeah.
And then had him sent from there to the center of international media.
I'm beginning to think the Shah was in on this.
Right, yeah. But no, the fact is that the Shah, whatever you want to say about him, I mean, he had some positive qualities, but he was also a deeply superstitious man. And in the end, he himself was a Shiite, and he did not want to kill a Shiite Ayatollah.
Yeah.
And so look, the mosques became the only sort of unbreachable
sanctuary.
Yeah. And all these marginalized political parties, including scandalously the National Front, the party of Mohammad Mossadegh, got behind Ayatollah Khomeini. Sure. Communist parties who were supposed to be atheists, Fadayan Khalq,
thinking, of course, they can control this old man, but then he ended up controlling all of them, more than controlling them. Yeah, very interesting. You know, I've never really known, because you see documentaries here in the United States, but who knows what the actual truth is. It's sort of like the JFK assassination. Maybe we'll never actually know who was behind it. But, you know, did you want to talk a little bit about going back a little bit in time to, you mentioned Mossadegh himself originally came out of the constitutional revolution of 1906. What are your thoughts on that constitutional movement, revolution? And before you actually go there, let me preface it this way, that I believe from my readings that its major accomplishment was the Majlis, a consultative body that's representative, and the Majlis, its major accomplishments, again, from what I've read, were many. They included, you know, improving some of the incredibly unfair concessions to European companies and oil consortiums, establishing the representative body itself, establishing a secular judicial system and code, which didn't exist in Iran prior to that time. And at least, I don't know how de facto correct this was, but on paper, a free press. And so those are real accomplishments. But however, I want to read you a line or two of yours about this, and I hope I didn't get it wrong, but you have said, I think, in Iranian Leviathan, that those who mistake the Iranian Revolution of 2022, 2023, as the culmination of the Persian constitutional revolution's aim of establishing a system wherein the rule of law would be paramount, are blind to these deeper forces of freedom for the sake of progress, which have teleologically defined the long arc of Iranian history from Zarathustra and the Achaemenids onward. And so this to me sounds like a tension between the legalistic and the antinomian, right, which you're pointing out, Apollonian, Promethean, you could say it, or I would say prosaic versus poetic, but you get what I'm saying. So if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, that's actually from some more recent notes that I sent you. Iranian Leviathan was published in 2019.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I mean, look, first of all, let me just step back for a moment and make the observation that most political commentators on Iran, even high-level analysts, whether they're working for the State Department or various governments, or whether they're in academia, they only understand revolution in the history of Iran in terms of the connection between 1979 and 1953, right? So as we were discussing, there's clearly this dialectical connection between the coup against Mossadegh and the warping of Iran's parliamentary constitution by the Shah's autocratic rule on the one hand, and then the tyranny of the Islamic Republic coming to power on the other hand, right? Where you had all these marginalized political parties feel like, out of desperation, they had no recourse but to ally themselves with these ayatollahs, who then turned on them within a year or two of the success of the revolution and had most of them, frankly, executed and others of them driven into exile, whether it was the Fadayan Khalq or Mujahideen Khalq or many members of the Tudeh.
Far more effectively than the Shah had ever done.
Much more brutally, much more effectively than the Shah had ever done. And so, look, there's certainly that dialectic, but those who have a little bit more political sophistication and who are more aware of the history of Iran understand that that dialectic goes back to the constitutional revolution. So as you were suggesting, this whole idea of the rule of law, of the strict implementation of a legal constitution, and basically the creation of a functional bureaucracy with a division of powers and so on and so forth, and a constitution that enshrines civil liberties such as freedom of the press. This all goes back, and the freedom of political parties. This all goes back to the constitutional revolution of, well, it spanned a few years between perhaps 1906, 1905, 1906, up to about, some people say 1909, depending on how you cut it, maybe up till 1911, all right? But the key years were about 1906 to 1909. And this makes the Persian constitutional revolution the first democratic parliamentary revolution in the Islamic world, not just in the Middle East, in the entire Islamic world.
Yeah.
And it's worthy of note that it took place not even within a year, within months of the Russian Revolution of 1905. So, I mean, this is not at all incidental, right? The Iranians had fought a number of wars with the Russians in the 19th century. These were and even before that, these were the Russo-Persian Wars. There were several phases in these Russo-Persian Wars.
I think at least three, yeah.
At least three.
Yeah.
And two of them were in the 1800s, in the early 1800s.
By the way, Jason, the Persians did quite fairly well in the early ones, and of course, as time went on and they fell behind more and more technologically, by the time of the last one, it was barely a fair battle anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a tragedy. What happened in those there was deep snow. It was the depth of winter. They didn't send sufficient boots and warm enough jackets to the troops at the front because the Qajar government was frankly corrupt. And anyway, those soldiers froze up there in the Caucasus. And
the point this is the loss of the Caucasus during that time.
Yeah. So, and here's my point: is that the whole Caucasus belonged to Iran, okay? What is now the so-called Republic of Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, very importantly, Georgia, where you have the Ossetians, the remaining Scythian Iranians. They're the last remnant of the Scythian Iranians. All of these territories were part of Iran, which Iran lost to Russia during the Russo-Persian War. Now, this is very significant in terms of the connection between the Russian Revolution and the Persian Constitutional Revolution, because a lot of the leaders of the, Persian Constitutional Revolution, like Taghisade, Dolatabadi, Musavat, they relocated from the Caucasus to first Tabriz, and then were more active in Tehran. So you've got Iranians coming from the territories that have, within recent decades been claimed by Russia, and who therefore are acutely aware of the Russian Revolution, bringing a certain kind of, modernist discourse, right, into Tabriz and Tehran, acting as a catalyst.
Georgians, Armenians, yeah.
So in any case, 1906, you have a new constitution written in August of that year under Nasser al-Mulk. Nasser al-Mulk was the first Oxford-educated Iranian. So sadly, we have to say that it was under an Oxford-educated prime minister of the Qajar court that we had the first constitution of Iran approved in August of 1906. And it was accepted by Muzaffar-ad-Din Shah Qajar. Muzaffar-ad-Din Shah had also traveled widely in Europe. And, he was a fairly broad-minded man. Interestingly, the guy died only 40 days after he accepted Nasr al-Mulk's constitution. And he was only 53 years old. So, of a heart attack, supposedly.
Maybe they needed him to sign on, and then they didn't need him anymore. Who knows?
I mean, it's a little odd to me, right? But in any case, he unfortunately dies. So the Shah accepted the constitution, and he accepted the formation of the first parliament, the Majlis. Yeah. So this was done, under the authority of the monarchy, with the cause being championed by the Shah's prime minister. And the other relevant point there is that this was not so much a revolution from beneath. We tend to think of revolutions as like downtrodden, outcries of the oppressed, and as populist, uprisings. A lot of people from within the Qajar aristocracy supported this revolution. The Farman Farma family, Ehtisham al-Saltaneh, Abdul Hassan Mirza. These were all prominent aristocrats of the period who got behind the cause of constitutionalism, I think because they were tired of petty autocracy and they wanted a functional system, to protect themselves and their families, and to have a civil society in the context of which they would feel more secure. So in any case, it had the backing of the monarchy, it had the backing of the aristocracy, and this constitution was approved and a parliament was formed. Unfortunately, after Muzaffar-ad-Din Shah Qajar died, his son, Muhammad Ali Shah, came to power and proceeded to ally himself with certain foreign interests who wanted this constitutional revolution to fail. British, ironically, Russians, certain Russian Tsarist conservatives. And Muhammad Ali Shah bombs the parliament. He subjects the Majlis to artillery bombardment.
Didn't the Russians do that as well?
No, that was him acting as a sort of agent.
The Cossacks, probably. Yeah. Interesting.
The Russians formed something called the Cossack Brigade.
Yeah, Cossack Brigade.
In Iran. And more what wound up happening as the constitutional revolution failed is that northern Iran wound up being controlled by the Russian Cossack Brigade, and southern Iran more and more by the South Persia Rifle, which was a British organization. Yeah. And so the constitutional revolution, there's this coup against it in 1908, by Muhammad Ali Shah. And then, later on in 1909, you have Sattar Khan come from the north, the kind of like guerrilla mercenary insurgent leader and bring together a wide array of forces from mainly like Gilan, Mazandaran, the areas around the Caspian Sea, Azerbaijan, and they all marched on Tehran, and they basically deposed Muhammad Ali Shah. I think he fled to Russia initially, and they executed this conservative Ayatollah who had been supporting Muhammad Ali Shah's coup, a man by the name of Fazlullah Nuri. And he was like a proto-Ayatollah Khomeini kind of figure who, interestingly enough, characterized the constitutionalists as, quote, free thinkers, Babis, those are the Baha'is of the time.
Sure, yeah. Pre-Baha'i. Yeah.
Babis, nihilists, anarchists, socialists, advocates of licentious and irreligious agendas, unquote.
But do they have any negative aspects?
Exactly. Right. So this is a rather wild bunch, and you can see the spirit of their thought reflected in newspapers of the time. Like you mentioned, free press. Well, there was a relatively free press in Iran for a few years as a result of the Constitutional Revolution, and even leading up to the Constitutional Revolution, there were some dissident newspapers which acted as a kind of medium for this discourse to be advanced. Papers like Qanun and
the law. I'm just translating for her.
Yeah, Qanun means law, right? Law, and so, as a matter of fact, hold on a second. There's a passage I just want to read really briefly. Sure. It's by a Qajar court minister, Malcolm Khan, who was exiled from Iran ultimately to London, and who wrote in Qanun in 1889, so like about 6 years before the Constitutional Revolution. He wrote this tirade against lawlessness. Quote, Iran is full of divine gifts. What has left all of these gifts unused is the absence of law. No one in Iran owns anything because there's no law. We appoint rulers without law. We remove officers without law. We sell what rightfully belongs to the government without law. We imprison God's subjects without law. We tear open bellies without law. There is no one who knows what amounts to an offense and what constitutes a service. What law did they use to exile such and such a mujtahid? What law did they use to stop such and such an officer's salary? What law was the basis of the removal of such and such a minister? What law was the basis of the title that was given to such and such an idiot? Mm-hmm. There is not a single governor or prince who can feel secure about his conditions of life as much as the foreign ambassador's slaves, unquote.
Wow. Yeah, I've recently read that same passage. It's quite stunning to hear, 1899, you say? So prescient.
1889. So
89,
no,
yeah.
a decade, about 15 years before the Constitutional Revolution. So this discourse was building for a while. And then in newspapers like Surah Esrafil, the trumpet of Esrafil, you had people like De Khuda, who later went on to compose the most significant Persian language dictionary. It was one of like the leading intellectuals of the time. People like De Khuda used this newspaper as a platform for some very erudite, rigorous, but also irreverent secular discourse. Another one of these early constitutionalist thinkers was Akhundzadeh, Mirza Fatali Akhundzadeh, or Akhundav, sometimes he's referred to. Very, very rabidly secular, anti-clerical figures. Now, in the Constitutional Revolution, though, you also had a kind of negotiation that took place between the clergy and these constitutionalists. And there was a role carved out within the Constitution for the clergy, because many of the clergy had also in that uprising had opposed monarchical autocracy, right? So this complex system of law was worked out, and ultimately it wasn't implemented by Reza Shah Pahlavi. Mossadegh tried to go back to it, and then in the coup against him, we wound up with another Pahlavi autocrat who undermined this constitution. All of those marginalized political parties got behind Khomeini, who proved to be another tyrant. And all the way up to the time of the Green Movement, the so-called reform movement under the Islamic Republic, you continued to have this discourse of rule of law, which was the aspiration of the constitutional revolution over a century ago in Iran.
I wonder what you think about the role of Reza Khan and then Reza Shah as he became soon thereafter. I sometimes, almost all Iranians know that he helped to unify the country and bring the tribes to heel, so on and so forth. Did quite a lot of things in terms of the basics of modernization. I sometimes see him as a Napoleonic figure, not in terms of conquest. That would be our closest version of that would be Nadir Shah, right? But in terms of the person who comes just after the revolution and in a sense consolidates that revolution. Do you see it the same way, or do you see him as anti-constitutionalist?
I'm going to get a lot of flack for what I'm about to say, but be that as it may.
It won't be the first time, Jason.
I'm no stranger to controversy. Look, there's an icon. There is a cardboard cutout. There is an idol that's been made of Reza Shah.
Yeah.
And when you go and you look, the devil's always in the details, at the details of how he came to power. That's not who he was. This guy was a member of the Russian Cossack Brigade. The highest ambition that he had in his years as an officer was to not serve in a brigade which had only a Russian officer corps running it. The Cossack Brigade had Russian officers.
Only Russians, yeah.
Soldiers underneath them, right? Yeah. And so all this guy wanted to do, by the way, he was an illiterate from Savadku, a village in Mazandaran.
Yeah.
And he didn't know anything about the Haqqa-Manashids or ancient Iranian history or anything like that. The discourse that he used in order to frame his Iranian nationalism once he was king, right? He didn't know anything about that. And so he was an effective foot soldier and ultimately wound up becoming the first officer in what had been a Russian-run
That's right.
Cossack Brigade. And the truth is...
First Iranian officer. Yeah.
Yes, and the truth is that he was an agent of the British against the Russians. The British were controlling southern Iran. They ultimately convinced the Russians to abandon northern Iran. And as the Russians abandoned northern Iran, Reza Khan acted at the behest of the British to bring order to northern Iran, which had become so lawless because of the corruption of the last Qajar monarchs. After the failure of the constitutional revolution, the last couple of Qajar monarchs were really corrupt and just ineffective. Okay.
And of course, during that time, the Russians really had their hands full too. So with the revolution going on in their own country. And so it was good timing, in a sense, from the British perspective to get them, if not out, at least reduce their role in Iran.
Exactly. So long story short, it's the British who put it into this officer's head that he needs to stage a coup against Ahmad Shah Qajar. It was a British plan. And because the British didn't want to waste the time and energy necessary to colonize Iran. I mean, this is the sad truth of things, is that they were getting enough from out of Iran economically in terms of concessions and access to ports and so forth that they didn't want to turn Iran into a colony. They wanted a guy who was their agent to basically bring some order and stability to this country, which would be good for their business. And so Reza Khan moves against the Qajar court as an agent of the British, having taken over a Russian, basically military organization. And that's how, it all begins with Reza Khan, okay? And I think it was partly based on his own guilt and shame over having come to power basically as an agent of the British that Reza Shah leans toward Hitler in the 1930s because he wants to dissociate himself from his former masters.
Yeah. And the Germans were trading with Iran. I think they were helping transfer technology and so on and so forth. So, people who say that he was a Nazi sympathizer, I'm not sure if that was really what it was. I think it was more the enemy of my enemy, a practical matter.
Yeah, and the other thing that has to be said about him is, for which again I'm going to get flack from frankly ignorant people, is that
that is to say the majority of Jason.
Yeah, they think this guy was some rabidly anti-clerical, even anti-Islamic, advocate of the heritage of ancient Iran. Go read the speech that Reza Shah gave when he became Reza Shah, the speech he gave to the Majlis, to the parliament, in which he praises Islam, praises Muhammad specifically, and vows to basically back the Ayatollahs. And it's in fact the Ayatollahs who convinced Reza Shah to become Shah rather than to be the prime minister of what could have been a secular republic. There was a lot of discussion with, what was going on with Ataturk in Turkey at the time, that Iran potentially would become a secular republic instead of a monarchy, that since the constitutional revolution had failed to reform the monarchy, the way to go was a secular republic. And you had all these anti-clerical...
And Reza Shah, of course, really looked up to Ataturk in a way. He was a bit of an idol for him. I'm not sure if Ataturk felt the same way, because Ataturk was actually, whatever you want to say about him, an enormously educated man. Reza Shah was not.
That's right. And nor would Ataturk, I hate to say, cozy up to Ayatollahs the way that initially Reza Khan did. And so basically this guy...
Could that be that it simply had to be the case during that time? Or do you think he was a believer? One never knows. In other words, was it a practical...
Here's the problem. Look, there's no question that Iran was suffering from territorial disintegration at the time. There was all kinds of lawlessness. And there was
almost no Iran.
Yeah. Among the lures, Khuzestan, the British wanted to separate Khuzestan, which was the oil-rich part of Iran, from the rest of the country. The Kurds were revolting. There was a mess, okay? And it's true that this guy with his Napoleonic boot basically saved the territorial integrity of Iran. No doubt about it. Now, he also threw under the bus the whole intelligentsia that was behind the constitutional revolution. These people wanted a parliamentary, liberal, free society, and they hated Ayatollahs. They were rabidly anti-clerical, and he went in, Reza Khan did, with the Ayatollahs, who advocated against the republic and for monarchy because they believed the monarchy is what could save the Ayatollahs, that the decree of the king would basically spare them from the wrath of the intelligentsia. And we wind up with a regime under Reza Shah where even the likes of Sadegh Hedayat don't feel safe in Iran. Sadegh Hedayat fled Iran because of Reza Shah and spent most of his life in either Paris or Bombay.
With the Parsis.
Yeah, and when he was in Bombay and he wrote The Blind Owl there, his great literary masterpiece, he so resented Reza Shah that he put a warning at the beginning of his book saying sale and publication of Iran is forbidden. He put that in there.
Yeah.
He was appalled by the censorship and autocracy of Reza Shah's regime.
It reminds me of the story of Ferdowsi not accepting the silver as opposed to the gold. It's too much of an insult. Yeah, exactly. No, just to push back on this a little bit and we can move off of it. I hear you, and you're right. It's a very unpopular view you're presenting. But nevertheless, you have to admit that he did save the nation in a sense that was, as you say yourself, on the brink of utter disintegration. And he did at least begin the basics of modernization, an educational system, a transport system, railroads and roads and universities and so on and so forth. And also some of the people that, unfortunately, sadly, it was mostly Westerners, academics that were patronized by the regime, such as Arthur Upham Pope and so on and so forth, really began to dig up the history of Iranian culture and architecture, so on and so forth, which led later, during the reign of Mohammad Reza Shah and Farah Diba and these sorts of things, to all sorts of cultural flowerings based on that rediscovery of the ancient past.
Yeah.
So it's a complex, nuanced situation for sure, right?
Yeah, no doubt. And you mentioned Arthur Pope, and his encyclopedic study.
That's right.
Persian art. There's also this figure I had wanted to mention in the context of the constitutional revolution, just to go back for a moment. Edward Brown.
E.G. Brown, yeah.
Edward G. Brown
Yeah.
was a British gentleman who wrote 3 books about, as it was called in those days, Persia.
Called in the West, yeah.
One of them was a study of the Constitutional Revolution, which he lived through. And so it's a very interesting account of the times that I would recommend people look at. And another one was basically like a study of the Persian people, A Year Amongst the Persians, I believe it was called.
Among the Persians, yeah.
And it's a very sympathetic portrayal of Persians in the period of the Constitutional Revolution. So yeah.
Well, it also reminds me of Howard Baskerville is another, the American, you know, I know there's a recent book about him by Reza Aslan, I think, about his role. I think he died actually fighting for Iranian independence. He was a missionary originally. I'm sure you're familiar.
Yeah, so I just wonder what would have happened. Look, there's no doubt that Reza Shah's accomplishments are just as you said. And in fact, I mean, publicly, I've been a supporter of the legacy of Reza Shah for many years, right? But I just wonder what would have happened if, more people like Baskerville and Brown and so forth had been able to give the proper, because of course, the Constitutional Revolution met its demise at the hands of Qajar conservatives and Ayatollahs who were being backed by the British and by Russian czarists and so forth. So if, let's say, America had come in more strongly and backed the constitutionalist forces, I wonder what kind of an Iran we could have had instead of the one that Reza Shah shaped.
Sure. So many of these what ifs. Iran has had so many revolutions and evolutions and invasions that literally, in the sense of the word revolution, turned the country upside down in a sense. And so it's actually amazing to me that despite the Arab invasions, Alexander, the Timurids, the Mongols, so on and so forth, that it still survives, that there's still a sense of some continuity. And I wonder if, some people have said that it's sort of made up. I don't think that's the case. I think, yeah, I'm sure, I know you're not one of those, but the notion, for example, that Iran is a new country and Persia is an old country is something that I always push back on because that's absurd. Persia is simply the exonym, the name that was used erroneously in the West for what has always been called Iran by Iranians, which is a cognate of the word Aryan or Aranshah, right, as you know. And just because I think it started with the Greeks, where at some point, just as a shorthand, they began to refer to all of Iran as Persia, simply because that's where the administrative capital was, and that's who they were dealing with. In fact, even the Greeks, not to get too much into the weeds, but originally called them the Aryans and the Medes. It was only a certain point during the Persian Wars that they began to use the shorthand Persian instead of Iran. And so, it's so hard to explain to people who are unaware of all this, who imagine that Iran is some brand new nation, sort of like Iraq, a made-up country, and Persia is an extinct nation from the past. Nothing could be further from the truth. There has been continuity. Iran has always called itself that from the time of the Avesta, through the Sasanians, through the Parthians, so on and so forth. And so when Mohammad Reza Shah went to the international community and asked that they refer to the country as Iran henceforth, he wasn't changing the name. He was saying, please refer to us correctly by the name that we refer to ourselves as. He wasn't renaming the country at all. But somehow that didn't sink in. And I think it's again ironic because we lost in the West all the positive connotations, to the extent that there were any, of the word Persia. And Reza Shah wanted to gain the positive connotations that come with the word Aryan, but the word Iran doesn't sound like Aryan in the English language. So that connection wasn't made. We lost Persia and gained nothing. And of course, Aryan came to be associated with Nazis and racists. So they took our name, did horrible things under that name, and now we can't use the word anymore. It's just bizarre,
Yeah, I mean, as I pointed out in my writings, you're exactly right. In the earliest Greek texts, you see the country referred to as Ariana,
Oh, yeah, I know.
The population are called Oryoi, which is to this day how Afghani Tajiks and Tajiks in Tajikistan pronounce the word Aryan, Oryoi.
Yeah. Oryoi, yeah.
And so, that's the reference that the Greeks had for the Median kingdom. And then when Persians took over the Medes, they started calling the place Persia because its capital district was in Persis.
Persis, yeah.
Stuck.
Pars today.
Often you will see in Herodotus and other Greek texts the reference to Persia and Media, or the Persians and the Medes. And so it's this combination, the synthesis of the Persians and the Medes, and then also the Scythians, who were referred to as Oryoi as well, and understood to be Iranians by the Greeks. It's this synthesis that has been Iran from the beginning, which again was called Aryana in ancient Iranian, in old Iranian, and then became contracted to Iran in Middle Persian, or in the Pahlavi language.
Iran Shah, yes, exactly, yeah.
Sassanid period. So Aryana Khashatra becomes Iran Shahr, Aryan Empire, Aryan Imperium.
Yeah. It's very sad these days because, again, that term has been so polluted with its association with Nazi ideology that, to try to explain to someone, it's an uphill battle to try to explain to them, look, there is a connection between these people, ethno-linguistically, for sure, but it's not us who it's not the Eastern Aryans who committed the genocide, right? And in fact, it's the Eastern Aryans who have always self-designated by that word. The Western Aryans never really used that word until it was adopted in the 19th century as an appropriation. And then they took the name, they stole the identity in a sense, or the name, committed atrocities under that name, and now we're not allowed to use our own name anymore. So my hope is that we can reclaim that name and disassociate it from the ideology of Hitler,
Yeah, well, what I want to say next, I think, goes a long way toward doing that, because you do have some people in the Iranian opposition today with whom I have worked closely, who are very right-wing in their political worldview, and who have portrayed Iran Shah, the Aryan Imperium. That was the name of the country during the Sassanid period.
That's right. 500, maybe even during the Parthian era, right? The Ashkanians.
Absolutely. The Parthians called their country Aryana Khashatra still. Aryana Khashatra.
So between the Parthians and the Sasanians, Jason, that's almost 1,000 years. 800 years.
It's of about 200 years of Greek rule. So the identity, Iran's identity was so cemented by the Parthian period that despite 200 years of Greek colonization, Iran Shah reemerges in the Sassanid era. And it reemerges through the conquests of this character Ardashir Babakan, Ardashir Babakan, or Babakan, it's pronounced both ways.
The B's and the P's, yeah.
Who came from a priestly clan in Pars, again, the province of Iran that the country was named Persia on the basis of by the Greeks.
Persis.
There are a lot of these there are some right-wing people in the Iranian opposition today who really valorize this character Ardashir Babakan. And they see him in a positive light as a kind of Constantine, who created a state Orthodox religion to basically cement the power of this dynasty that went on to rule for 4 centuries, the Sassanid dynasty.
Yeah.
And I want to push back against this narrative with a view to broadening the scope of understanding the revolutionary history of Iran. In other words, as I mentioned earlier, most analysts can only begin to fathom the type of forces that are at play in the streets of Iran today on the basis of a dialectic between the 1979 revolution, Mossadegh, maybe the constitutionalist revolution.
Yeah, back to those Paleolithic times.
Yeah, and they're utterly clueless of the earlier revolutions in Iran's history. In fact, there are modern European thinkers like Eric Voegelin. Eric Voegelin, the political theorist who wrote about science and Gnosticism. And he, among others, argued that revolution is a modern idea and that there were no revolutions at all prior to modernity, you had slave revolts and so forth, but no revolutions. Revolution is a mod. Now, I reject this idea entirely.
Yeah,
And
it's
Western
simply
idea,
ignorant of Iranian history for sure.
it's ignorant of Iranian history. It's like these retards who believe in Tartaria, this Tartaria conspiracy theory. They think like hundreds of years of like West of history have been sort of like, you know, replaced or misplaced or whatever. And they don't stop to look at Iranian history and look at the whole historical continuity that we have in Iranian history texts, right? I mean, there's another history, folks. And in the history of Iran, there were certainly revolutions prior to the modern age, and there were revolutions in every sense that the French Revolution is a revolution. Yeah. And the most significant of them took place at the apex of the Sassanid period.
Yeah. Well, before you jump into that, Jason, I would say that maybe you can even go further back and say that at least intellectually or spiritually, the Zoroastrian revolution is the first revolution. But I see what you're saying in the sense that certainly under Mazdak, I think where you're going, it became political. But Zoroastrianism for sure is a revolution in the sense that it entirely inverts the Indo-Iranian pantheon and sides with the Titans, as you have written extensively over the Ahuras and Ashuras, which are the equivalent of the Titans in Greek terminology, as opposed to the Devas, which is not simply some irrelevant changing of names, but the Titans are on the side of humankind, right? As opposed to an Abrahamic type or Zeus type god that's trying to suppress humanity. And so it's not just one regime replacing another, but what a fundamental change in ethos and an understanding of what it means to be human. Or, you know, even today, one thing that, you know, long before I read your work, of course, you've put it much more extensively and eloquently, but long before I read your work, I always had a problem with all these movies that we've grown up with, where the scientist is the mad, evil scientist, all right? That any time that human beings try to make things better, to try to improve nature, it ends up being a disaster, and they learn their lesson and they're punished for it. And I always thought, you know, why? Why does it have to be that way? Because if nature is natural selection or sexual selection in a pure Darwinian way, isn't that just throwing spaghetti at the wall? And isn't conscious decision making, even though it might make mistakes at times, a better solution than natural selection, where in a Lamarckian sense, isn't Lamarck in a way more progressive than Darwin? And so I think that thought process of mine is not entirely unlike your Prometheist project.
Very much so. And I think that what you mentioned is an absolutely indispensable precondition to understanding what it was that I was about to lay out. Because, you see, the struggle that takes place during the course of the Sasanian period is a struggle over the legacy of Zarathustra. And, you know, there's no doubt that Zarathustra's revolution, and it was that, was the first revolution, not only in Iranian history, it's the first revolution that we can see in recorded human history.
A philosophical one, rather than just one regime replacing another or one set of capricious gods replacing another, but a difference in a real change in ethos.
Yes, although it should also be mentioned that it wasn't only a spiritual revolution, it was the most fundamental spiritual revolution. I think frankly, it was the most fundamental spiritual revolution that has ever taken place to this day even. Yeah. It was the most basic reorientation of the entire worldview of humanity, which sadly, I think, largely wasn't accepted, even in Iran, as I'm about to explain. Many people didn't accept it. Sure. Because it's radically about human empowerment and against any conception of overlords to which we owe obeisance and obedience and worship, right? And it is a Promethean message of the radical self-determination of our spiritual destiny. But it was also a political revolution, insofar as Kafi Vishtaspa, or Keyqobad, as Ferdowsi calls him, gave his full political backing to Zarathustra after Zarathustra was exiled on account of the revolutionary character of his message. He was exiled from the area around Lake Urumia in Iranian Azerbaijan, to basically fled to Khorasan, northern Khorasan. And there he found the patronage of Kavi Vishtaspa, who, according to Ferdowsi, had a son, Esfandiar, who becomes a sword-wielding knight in shining armor, the
Zoroastrian prince,
the cause of Zoroastrianism by the sword, and goes and converts a lot of Scythians and other people in that area to Zoroastrianism.
In fact, Jason, I talked about this very thing in a podcast I just did, which touched upon, very at a surface level Iranian mythology, where I talk about Esfandiar, and we're not the first ones to say this, but I think we're in full agreement on this, that perhaps Esfandiar versus Rostam is exactly that the new Zoroastrian prince against the old Mithraic, more pagan, Aryan, Indo-European kind of cowboy, as you say, or nature man.
Yeah, no doubt. And so to go back to the Sasanian period with this necessary preface, Ardashir Babakan has this really orthodox conception of what Zoroastrianism means, okay? And he calls it Vehdin, the good religion. And he's coming from a priestly clan, so he's literally clergy. He's clergy himself. And he has these two other clerics that he's in close association with. He's in league with this guy, Kartir. And some people have said that this other character, Tansar, that this was actually just a pseudonym for Kartir, that they're the same figure. In any case, whether it was Kartir alone, who also used the name Tansar, or whether it's Kartir and Tansar, there are these two other names of clerical figures that are associated with Ardashir Babakan from the start of his career, and they're his ayatollahs, frankly. I'm going to get my skin flayed for saying this, but they're his ayatollahs. And they develop an extremely persecutory, legalistic, litigious conception of Zoroastrianism, which frankly, if you go back and read the Gathas, is utterly anathema. Not only is it an anathema to the message of Zarathustra, it's diametrically opposed in its basic spirit to the kind of progressive mentality, sepantaminu, that Zarathustra's whole teaching turns around. And so, for example, you have Kartir going out and persecuting Buddhists of all people.
Yeah.
And laws that, prescribe.
This is before the Iranian influenced Mahayana, or is it before or after that? Do you remember?
Here's what makes it so horrible, is that by this time, we had already had this very cosmopolitan culture under the Parthians.
For sure.
There was a blend of Eastern and Western philosophy and religion. Yeah. And in that context, the Iranians created Mahayana Buddhism. And in particular, there was a group of they were Scythians. They were Scythians. Yeah. They went to northern India, and they became this kingdom called the Kushans.
Kushan kingdom,
became the first patrons of Mahayana Buddhism. And so 1/3 of the Iranian world is Buddhist at this time.
Yeah.
This is where the great Buddhas at Bamyan that were destroyed by
the Taliban,
come from. Eastern Iran was the heartland of Buddhism at this period. And it was only Iranian missionaries like Bodhidharma and later Padmasambhava, both of whom were Iranian, and I've made a case for this in my writings. It's only these Iranian missionaries that took Buddhism along the Silk Route into East Asia later. At this period, when Ardashir is coming to power, Eastern Iran is Buddhist. And he sends this Kartir to go persecute these Buddhists and ban the practice of their religion within the Sasanian realm. They codify laws that are as inhumane and retarded as, for example, whipping women who hide the fact that they're having their period, because if they're menstruating, they shouldn't be involved in any social activities, and they should be confined to something called a dakhmeh for the living. A dakhmeh is an enclosure where you put dead bodies. So they had these dakhmehs for the living, quote unquote, where women were stuck once a month. And if you tried to evade that and they caught you, you would get lashed. And these are the kinds of things you find in the Vandidad, the law books of the type of so-called Zoroastrianism framed by Ardashir Babakan with his mullahs, Kartir and Tansar.
See, this, Jason, it seems to me like with this variation of Zoroastrianism, it's becoming more and more like an Abrahamic religion. It's becoming legalistic in the worst sense of the word, right? Which is the opposite of its original intent. I've always said, you know, and I know it's not a perfect analogy, but that Zoroastrianism is a type of existentialism. And I'm borrowing that term or stealing it from Jean-Paul Sartre's phrase that existentialism is a humanism. I'm sure you know.
Yeah, well, the thing is, Darius, that's the kind of Zoroastrianism that was practiced in Iran for hundreds of years before the Sassanids.
Prior, yeah.
The Achaemenids had no official state religion. And the Achaemenids were referencing all kinds of other pagan deities, whether it's Mithra or Anahita in their inscriptions, even foreign gods like Marduk. And the Parthians have
a very Mesopotamian,
syncretistic religion in the Parthian period that, you know, it's got elements of Zarathustra's teaching in it. And certainly it represents a revival of Mithraism, of the ancient Iranian religion of Mithraism, but also, you know, is cosmopolitan enough that it has Greek pagan elements syncretically integrated into it as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there was a whole dialogue taking place with incipient Buddhism in the East. So this is what you had.
Also, this is not too far from the time of Mani as well, who was a syncretic type of personality who tries to bring together Christianity and Zoroastrianism and Buddhism and so on and so forth and make it into a world religion. I don't remember exactly if that was slightly after or before, but certainly during
it was in the reign of
times.
Ardashir's son. So what happens is, okay, contrary to what kind of an idol these right-wingers want to make out of Ardashir Babakan.
Hyper-nationalists.
Yeah. His own son repudiated his policies. Shapur the First, Shapur the Great, who I think actually deserves the title Great, he expanded the Sassanid realm by like 1/3 in terms of territory. And he was very much a Marcus Aurelius. He was a philosopher king type. He's the one who becomes the patron of Mani. He actually becomes the patron of Mani and backs Mani to travel along the Silk Route and bring his syncretic cosmopolitan religion to China and India, so forth. And
at the same time, keep in mind that I believe Saint Augustine was a Manichaean for a period of time during his 10 or 12 years of his adult life, although he turned against it and wrote polemics about it, of course, a little bit later.
Yes, and so when Shapur dies, unfortunately, Mani, I was going to say he was thrown to the wolves, but I love wolves, and I don't want to insult them by these monster Sassanid theocrats to wolves. But he was unfortunately at the mercy of these Sassanid theocrats after Shapur died. And even though he actually had a letter from Shapur that he used to carry around with him, and he stuck this letter in the face of Shapur's son, and apparently it only angered the guy more, Shah Bahram, and he was handed over to Kartir. And this bastard Kartir, he was able to exercise clerical authority through the reign of no less than 4 Sassanid monarchs. So Ardashir Babakan sets him up. Then he doesn't have much influence under Shapur because Shapur is a broad-minded philosopher king, basically. But then after Shapur dies, this bastard is still kicking, Kartir, and he has influence over the reign of 2 more Sassanid monarchs, during the course of which an incredibly orthodox form of Zoroastrianism takes shape as basically the religious foundation of the Sassanid state.
Inquisitional.
Yes. And the important thing is this, that the other heterodox movement at the time of Mani was a movement that framed itself as the authentic interpretation and development of Zarathustra's teaching in the face of what they believed was a perversion of that teaching by Ardashir Babakan. So Mani was a Gnostic dualist, and he was also a pacifist. And so, he was trying to synthesize the Gnostic Christ and Buddha, and there's a very pacifistic undercurrent involved there, and they were vegetarians and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
This other movement, which arose in the time of Ardashir Babakhan, so as Ardashir is trying to develop this priestly orthodoxy, you have these dissidents also in Fars, in the Pars province.
Yeah.
Led by a man whose name was supposedly Zardusht.
The younger Zoroaster, right?
Zarathustra, okay? Yeah. So there's a second Zarathustra.
Yeah.
Zardusht of Fasa, some district in Fars. And this Zardusht of Fasa frames this teaching, which is not pacifistic and believes in insurgent resistance against the Sassanid state, and has it has this fascinating theology. Some of the points of which I want to lay out just in brief so that people understand what it is we're even talking about here. But before I do that, why is this relevant? Well, because over the course of 300 years, from the 200s when Ardashir comes to power to about 500, this movement gains ground to the point where it becomes a populist uprising and is able to install a prime minister round about 500 AD during the reign of Kavod I, or Qobad, as Ferdowsi calls him. This movement becomes so influential that it's able to actually install a prime minister who's an adherent of the cause. And this man's name is Mazdak. And so the movement gets reframed, gets rebranded as Mazdakism.
Oh, it's so interesting to know that Mazdak actually had an official position. He wasn't a pure outsider in any way.
He was the prime minister of the country.
Yeah.
And so before I lay out what these people, thought, what their worldview was like, let's just say a few words about Mazdak. He was appointed by Kavod I. Kavod I comes to power in 488, I believe. And he's briefly displaced in an attempted coup by a man named Jamasp, another member of his family. But he's able to come back to power with the help of some mercenary fighters called the Heftalites. So there's this 2-year period where he's kind of displaced, I think, in 496 to 498. But basically, minus that interruption, he reigns from 488 to 531. In other words, Kavod reigns for more than a generation. And during that period, his prime minister and the executor, the engineer and executor of his policies is this Mazdak. And I mean, what do these policies consist of? The guy has the granaries of aristocrats opened and all of this stored up wealth of the feudal lords distributed to the general population. He goes and he breaks up what by that time were vast harems that Sassanid lords were starting to, accumulate themselves.
Yeah.
And they hate this when I say harems. This is these right-wing, Iranian nationalists, as if we didn't have harems in Iran before Islam. Of course we have. We invented them.
They learned it from us.
Okay, the Arabs got them from us. Anyway, so you had these filthy feudal landowners taking all the decent women from all these villages, and these poor guys in the villages couldn't find wives for themselves because, all the women from the village had been seized by these feudal lords. So he had the granaries open, redistributed food to the people, ended hunger, and broke up these harems and liberated their women. And when I say liberated their women, around 500 AD, this prime minister, from the khutbah, from the podium of state, starts advocating free love instead of monogamous marriage. And so just try to wrap your mind around this, okay? This is an empire as large and as powerful as Rome.
Yeah.
It has an incredibly sophisticated Byzantine-style bureaucracy.
Yeah.
There's advanced science and technology in the country. A lot of the great advances in science and technology that are attributed to the so-called Islamic Golden Age from the 900s to the 1100s had as their precedent the academies
and so on and so forth.
Shapur that were set up by Shapur the Great during the Sassanid period. And so you have advanced scientific institutions. When the academies were closed in the West, the academicians fled to Iran.
Yeah.
And so anyway, this is a sophisticated society on every level, from science and technology to state bureaucracy. It's a powerful empire. It's a superpower that's a rival of Rome and of Byzantium.
A rival that was never conquered by Rome after 700-800 years. We conquered everyone else. And it's astonishing to me, Jason, if we just throw this in the middle of this, that in Western history today, they're barely mentioned. Here are two superpowers that between them controlled the Occidental world for a good 700-800 years, if you include the Parthians and the Roman Republic on the one hand, and then the Sasanians and the later Roman Empire, and then the Byzantines on the other. For 800 years, they were at continuous either truce or war. And so clearly they were as strong as Rome. And yet when you mention Rome, every time the word Rome is mentioned, it should be Rome and Persia. But it's never mentioned. In Western historiography, when you talk about the Persian Empire, they're only thinking about the Achaemenians, as if it ended with Alexander. And I wonder if that's on purpose, because militarily the Persians actually did quite a lot better against the Romans than they did against the Greeks. I think partly to do with the chainmail and so on and so forth, and the advancements in military technology. If you want to claim that they didn't do too well against the Spartans and so on and so forth, which I think is exaggerated to begin with, but they held off Rome, which was 100 times stronger than the Spartans, for centuries. And not only were they powerful militarily, but as we're discussing here, there were communist revolutions, there were libertine revolutions, there was the Mazdakite philosophical movement, there was the Manichaean philosophical movement, so on and so forth, the origins of Mahayana Buddhism, and quite a bit of the early history of Christianity and Nestorian Christianity took place in the Sasanian Empire as well. And Armenia, of course, being the first Christian country on earth, no one mentions that Armenia, when it became Christian, was ruled by an Iranian, ethnically Iranian family. But so it's just amazing to me that not only does Western historiography not mention movements such as the Mazdakites, they don't even mention Persia. They don't even mention Iran, let alone these various highly influential movements that occurred during that time in that empire. And so I'm so grateful that people like you are spreading the word. Look, if you go into the world of specialized academia, it's there. The information is there, but somehow it doesn't percolate up to popular culture in any way. It doesn't make it to YouTube and to Discovery Channel and PBS and so on and so forth. And hopefully we'll find a way to change that soon.
I hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I do believe that it is to some extent by design. And
I agree with you.
You look at men like Toynbee or even Oswald Spengler. These are very conservative.
That's a decline of the West, yeah?
Yeah. These are, a study of history by Toynbee or Spengler's Decline of the West, and these are very conservative gentlemen. And
in fact, Jason, I have read that Toynbee may have been in British intelligence.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
And so look, if you really study the history of Iran, you're going to find things like what I'm about to lay out here. Okay. And these things are unsettling. So look, the same people who want to argue that there was never a modern revolution, that there was never a revolution before the modern age, right? As if like revolution started with the French Revolution and the cult of reason. They have a vested interest in people not knowing the history of Iran.
Because they may want to replicate that again.
Exactly, because look, if you want to study history in terms of the broad arc of dialectical forces, which is how a Spengler studies history, right? And you look at the Sassanid period and what happened with the Mazdakite revolution that we're discussing, you realize that there are dialectical forces that have been in play for centuries earlier than your French Revolution. And these forces are still in play today. I mean, we're not having this conversation just out of like theoretical interest, as some abstract scholarly, exercise. We're having this discussion because people are fighting and being killed in the streets in Iran today. And I believe, as I'll come back around to arguing, or at least suggesting, that historical forces that were set in play during the Mazdakite revolution are still on an unconscious level playing themselves out as the unfoldment of Iran's historical destiny today. Okay, and so what I want to suggest ultimately is that you can't really understand what is motivating the youth in Iran today and what vision of the future they have if you only go back to the constitutional revolution. I mean, forget Mossadegh and the coup in 53, okay?
No, it takes all agency away from the Iranians themselves.
Yeah, or if you think that this revolution of women, life, and freedom, Zan Zendegi Azadi, is just a repudiation of the Islamic Revolution of 1979. No, it's not, and it is not a question of simply creating a regime based on the rule of law, which was the aspiration of the constitutional revolution of 1906. The dialectical forces at play today go much further back, right? So to revisit that, you got this guy Mazdak, prime minister, not for 5 years, 10 years, for an entire generation. How is it that in a society that sophisticated, the great world rival of Rome, you had radical communism in terms of an economic industrial model, free love, and basically the advocacy of a different family model than monogamy and the nuclear family? Literally, Mazdak was
before the beatniks.
Yeah, I mean, from the podium of state was advocating communal raising of children, and the aristocrats were attacking him, and we know this, as is the case of many Gnostic movements, we know about it based on because their own texts, as I'm about to get into, their own texts were consigned to flames. Their books were burned. So we know largely about what went on through the attacks leveled at them by conservatives, by the Zoroastrian clergy. And the Zoroastrian clerics and the aristocrats are saying, after this, 20, 30 years of Mazdakite rule under Kavad I, we don't know who's child anymore. We don't know who's the child of who anymore. There's so much.
You can't protect bloodlines.
Exactly. And see, it's not just that this guy's some hippie countercultural whatever, right?
Allen Ginsberg.
Not Allen Ginsberg, as the prime minister of Iran or whatever. The guy had an agenda. There was an agenda to just because, see, Zoroastrian country shouldn't be like the caste system in India. Zarathustra, one of the things he preached against in the Gathas, one of the fundamental, points of his repudiation of the Deva religion, the Hindu religion, was his rejection of the caste system and his recognition of the value of human individuality and the worth of the human individual and human free will and self-determination. So in that period, around about 400s, 500s, a caste system had started to develop in Iran. The class divisions were so severe between the aristocrats and the commoners, the dehqans, and ordinary people, that it was
a feudal system.
It was becoming a really harsh feudal system, almost a caste system, where the place you were born into in life was the place you could expect to stay for the rest of your life. And so this idea of free love, after he broke up the harems, was also very precisely targeted at destroying the aristocratic bloodlines. And it was succeeding at that, if the laments of their adversaries are anything to go by. And he also was teaching that the sacred needs no temple, that people don't need to gather in a temple to be connected to the sacred. And in villages where Mazdakism had prevailed, you couldn't find any central temple. People just observed their own spirituality on an individual basis. So this was a disaster for the mobeds, for the priests who ran the various, Zoroastrian temples across the country.
This is as if the 60s counterculture had succeeded in taking over the presidency and the Congress and the Supreme Court.
To put it in somewhat more, yeah, I mean, that's a great stark analogy, but to put it in a somewhat more believable historical context, it's like if the Carpocratian Gnostics, the most libertine antinomian Gnostics of Alexandria, were to have succeeded in convincing a Caesar in Rome to adopt their teaching and then impose Carpocratianism on the empire, which for people who are students of Western history, like, that's insane. If you wrote a science fiction story, alternative history, sci-fi story about that, it would be considered trash.
It's unrealistic, yeah.
You can't even have the level of suspension of disbelief to make reading a book like that enjoyable.
And yet it happened.
And yet it happened. In Iran, that's exactly what happened. And the story is even more dramatic than that because, well, now let me not get ahead of myself. I want to give some kind of, substance to what it is these people believed in, right? I mean, what worldview was behind these kinds of state policies? So these Mazdakites, of course, said that they were followers of Zarathustra, but that after Zarathustra, there were many other sages who were basically representatives of the divine unfolding in history. They called it, in the Arabic preservation of this account, it's been translated into Arabic as Silsilat al-Irfan, the chain of succession of Gnosis, the dynasty or chain of succession of Gnosis, or of the Gnostics. And so you had these sages throughout the course of history who the Mazdakites viewed as the legitimate heirs of Zarathustra. And these sages supposedly had an exoteric message that they would propound for the masses and an esoteric teaching that was preserved among a spiritual elite. But that, Zarathustra, of course, it bears repeating, was the first person to think of a linear teleological conception of a history that's going somewhere, right? It's not cyclical, that's epochal, it has epochs and phases, ending with an apocalypse, with some future end of history.
Yeah.
So did you want to interject something before I?
No, just and just the fact that that there's the difference between cyclical and teleological is extremely important because it has to do with free will. Because if it's cyclical and the same thing's happening again and again, then there's no room for free will, right? So even if you don't believe in a deity, it's still deterministic, whether you call it the laws of nature or gods or God. But if there's free will involved, which is that consciousness, again, nature having become conscious of itself, then there's an actual direction that has to do with, as maybe Omar Khayyam might have put it poetically, to be able to shape a new reality that's closer to the heart's desire, right?
Absolutely.
And it's amazing to me that Khayyam in Muslim times, 12th century, 13th century, something like that, is essentially echoing an ethos and a philosophy and a worldview that goes back to original Zoroastrianism in a sense.
Some of his teaching does.
So there's your continuity right there.
Yeah, and so they have this teleological conception of history coming from out of Zarathustra, and they're teaching that there will come a time when the esoteric truth can be revealed and exoteric trappings of religion can be dispensed with. And Mazdak basically makes the claim that that moment in history has arrived, right? And so he's out to smash the facade of any kind of exoteric religious practice and basically bring people into a direct relationship with the divine. And so in addition to this exoteric divide and this chain of gnosis that these Mazdakites believed in, they also thought that the process of reaching enlightenment took many lifetimes. So people often, in their ignorance, think that reincarnation is not an Iranian belief. Not true at all. Not true at all. Okay. If you go back and look at the Greek texts, like from Plutarch's era, talking about what Magi believed in, he says there were various Magi who believed in reincarnation. Moreover, Mani, with the whole religion that he creates, has reincarnation as one of the fundamental tenets in his belief system. The Iranians who shaped Mahayana Buddhism obviously believed in reincarnation. And it's also the case that the Mazdakites did. And so, for example, the Mazdakites, as in the case of the Manichaeans, were vegetarians because they believed that not only could you be reincarnated as a human, in the worst case scenario, you might be reincarnated as an animal, and you want to make sure that you don't eat your dead uncle. So,
I'll just throw in a contradictory sort of aside here about vegetarianism that I've said before, that I say it in Mistake of Identity, that vegetarianism is also selfish in a sense, because if you're doing it because you think you may be born that animal, it's still, you're doing it for selfish reasons, except it's an expanded sense of self.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think these Mazdakites had an expanded sense of self in all kinds of positive ways. And but to get into some of the deeper aspects of their belief system, see, and this is coming out of a background of the kind of Mithraic worldview that the Parthians had, I think. The Mazdakites believed that Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, the two deities of Zoroastrianism.
God and devil, let's say.
Yeah. They were both subordinate to and derived from a primordial lord of time, namely Zorvan, or what in Greek you could call Kronos. And interestingly, the Mazdakites, and this is the kind of thing that really made these conservative Mobads nervous. The Mazdakites believed that they had this fascinating creation myth where they said that Zorvan was suffering from a sense of primordial lack. So Zorvan, the god of time, before the cosmos exists, has no frame of reference, has no way of knowing himself or herself. They thought of Zorvan as an androgynous deity. And so Zorvan longs to know himself or herself and suffers from this primordial lack or need. And this Oz, this primordial lack or need or desire, this Oz seduces from within himself Zorvan to conceive and give birth to two twins. But the one that comes out first is Ahriman. Mm-hmm. And then the second twin that's born is Ahura Mazda. And so the realm goes to the firstborn. So the world is delivered over to Ahriman. So we live in a world delivered over to Ahriman. And originally. And in the symbolism of this myth, if you want to read it in terms of archetypal psychology, what it's saying in esoteric symbolism is that God is in the first place unconscious and evil. And only over time, over the course of history, history of Zarathustra, does God become good and wise, which is Ahura Mazda. That's why Ahura Mazda is born second.
So darkness is the default and light is a miracle in a sense.
Yes, and history is kind of like a purgative process where you have to process the darkness. And after Ahriman is born from out of Zorvan, Ahriman winds up basically engendering this whole race of demons together with that primordial concupiscence that I mentioned earlier, which is portrayed as feminine, this Oz, this, need or deep desire or lust that basically is responsible for the conception of Ahriman from out of Zorban. That then enters into a rapport with Ahriman, and together they engender this whole race of demons. And so the Mazdakite teaching was about how to deal with these demons. And they named 5 of them that are like archdemons. Like you have archangels or which, by the way, it comes from
The other
Zoroastrianism.
way around. Yeah, absolutely. It comes directly from.
Amesha Spentas, the 7 Amesha Spentas, which are sort of facets of the consciousness of Ahura Mazda, these become the basis for the archangels. And
Oh yeah, you've spoken extensively about the influence on Christianity of Mithraism and a very Zoroastrianized Judaism. So between the Zoroastrianized Judaism on the one hand and a Perso-Roman Mithraism on the other hand, that's 80% of Christianity right there.
Exactly. So just like you have these archangels, you also have on the side of Ahura Mazda, you also have these archdemons, and they are need, greed, envy, lust, and anger or wrath. Okay, this is how the Mazdakites laid out what these demonic forces are that dominate human destiny until and unless we confront them and process them the right way. Envy, need, greed, lust, and wrath.
Very Jungian.
The whole thing is very Jungian, and in fact, I want to make a very specific reference to Jung a little bit, down the road here, in terms of understanding the relevance of this to Iran today. So, how to deal with these 5 demons is through what are greed and avarice about? They're about property, right? And control of property, and who's poor and who has resentment against the rich because the rich are hoarding goods, and how industry is set up to basically keep a group of people perpetually in poverty in order to satisfy the egos of these feudal lords. And so Mazdak, basically as a mouthpiece for this much older teaching of the Zarathustra of Persia, the second Zarathustra, Mazdak says that the way to deal with this is to get rid of private property, right? So you address need and greed and avarice through elimination of private property and basically the eradication of poverty. And then there's also lust, right? And vengeance. And often that's about women. And
which is connected to property also, again.
To property because women were chattel.
Yeah.
Including in Sasanian Iran, which a lot of these conservative neo-Sassanid people don't like to admit. Right?
Yeah.
So the HaChamanashids had very progressive policies toward women and the place of women in Iranian society. And I think this continued in the Parthian period, and you really see it in the pirate navy of the Parthians in the Mediterranean.
By the way, Jason, let me throw in here before you, because I'll forget on this point, another person who agrees with you very much on on the notion that the Parthians were far more advanced in the sense that they were much more syncretic, much more eclectic, much more open compared to the Sasanians, is no less than the former Monty Python, who's passed now, Terry Jones. And I had some connection with him. We were working on a project together some years back, but he passed, unfortunately. He did a series called, for BBC, I think originally, called Barbarians. It was ironically named, about all the enemies of Rome. And one of the episodes was called The Brainy Barbarians, about the Greeks and the Persians during Parthian Sasanian times, not the Achaemenians, right? Because it's against the Romans. And he makes that exact same point, that here you had an extremely advanced, cosmopolitan, syncretic, open society. And of course, his contention was it was partly because of the reaction to Rome that they became more insular under the Sasanians, which may be true. I've heard the other way around as well, that perhaps the Romans adopted Christianity as a reaction to the
That's my thesis. The second is my thesis.
The second, yeah.
Ardashir was responsible for Constantine. That's my thesis.
I've done not the other way. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
So look, you had a very progressive attitude toward women, both in the Haqamanashid and Parthian period, but not so in the Sassanid period.
Yeah.
And so this was very much a reaction. So when we think about Zan Zendegi Azadi, women, life, freedom, the first movement of Zan Zendegi Azadi was Mazdakism.
Yeah.
That's no doubt about it. And it took over the Sassanid state for 30 years before it was finally put down in a conservative coup. But okay, anyway, I got derailed from trying to connect these state policies to metaphysical ideas and archetypal psychology, right? So the abolition of private property, the institutionalization of free love, or at least, basically presenting some alternative to
traditional marriage.
Yeah, feudal monogamy, right? Or feudal treatment of women as chattel, effectively, right? These were two of the pillars of the Mazdakite program during the years that Mazdak was Kavad's prime minister. And so the purpose of, basically of being able to process these demonic forces and overcome them was, according to the Mazdakites, to achieve understanding. No, sorry. The proper order of this should probably be discernment, recollection, understanding, and joy. These were four principles that they had. Discernment, which, by the way, is the term that Gautama uses, bodhi, which becomes the basis of the definition of Buddhism as Buddhism, as the bodhi dharma, right? So discernment in that sense. Then understanding in the sense that, Hegel uses the word understanding like reaching full self-consciousness, like really, not just having information or knowledge about things, but coming to a wise, a wise grasp of the world, right, on a conceptual basis. And then when they talk about recollection here, I think that we're dealing with the idea that Plato adopts from out of, Pythagoras and Heraclitus and others who were very closely connected to the ancient Persian Empire, namely the idea of anamnesis, recollection as anamnesis, which goes back to the fact that the Mazdakites believe in reincarnation. So recollection is a recollection of, all that you learned in previous lives and who it was that you were, that you forgot that you were, wow. Where, like, you drink the milk of forgetfulness, or from the river of forgetfulness in the Bardo state between death and rebirth, which you see in, Plato's Republic. Imagery that I'm sure that Plato got from having been a member of the Pythagorean order, Pythagoras, again, having studied in the capital of Iran for a dozen years. And then finally, joy, right? This idea of joyousness, of, khush budan, right? That you see Omar Khayyam repeatedly say in his quatrains.
It's referred to as hedonism here, but it's not exactly.
It's a crass misinterpretation. He said, khush bash ke umr javedani in hast. Be joyous, for this is immortal life. And it goes back to the idea of ushta in the Gathas of Zarathustra. Ushta means radiant happiness, in like the sense that the Hindu word ananda means bliss, achieving ananda. It's like a kind of like perpetual, elevated, joyous state of being.
Yeah.
But it was connected to this very libertine, antinomian way of life that the Mazdakites were preaching. And so this was the goal of Mazdakism, basically embodying these four principles through the overcoming of these five demons. And that's the basis for these various state policies. So after 30 years, during the course of which I think these mobeds kept sitting there together with the aristocrats and saying to themselves, when is this shit going to fall apart? Like, this can't keep going on forever. I mean, how can these people successfully run a state? And probably they were waiting for the thing to implode, but it never did. It never did. Somehow these people successfully managed the world's, one of the two great empires of the world, and one of its most sophisticated bureaucracies, and implemented a communist countercultural revolution until these aristocrats and clerics put their foot down and deposed. Actually, what they did before they deposed Kavad was they forced Kavad to invite Mazdak to the royal court at Ctesiphon on like an off day, like, come to work Saturday, Mr. Prime Minister, like we want to have a talk with you, right? And he shows up.
Sounds like the beginning of a bad mafia movie.
Yeah, and here's all the clerics, the conservative clerics there, and he's invited to a so-called debate with the clerics, in the course of which he's supposedly refuted, and they say that his demonic teaching is going to basically lead to a world where aristocrats don't know who their children are, and there will be irreligion and impiety and blah, 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 blah. and they sentence him. They excommunicate him. They remove him as prime minister, and they sentence him to death. And before they execute him, Khosrow, Kavad's son, who has the whole time, during the whole reign of his father, Kavad, Khosrow has had it in for this Mazdak character. And Khosrow's been building ties with these conservative clerics. Khosrow leads Mazdak by the arm to his private garden on the palace grounds at Ctesiphon. And unbeknownst to Mazdak, before this charade inside the Darbar, inside the royal court, Khosrow had already taken Mazdak's closest lieutenants, men and women. Women were prominent leaders of the Mazdakite movement. We have records of that. And he had planted these poor Mazdakites upside down, face down, up to the shoulders in the mud of his garden, with their legs kicking in the air as tree branches, as it were, proverbial tree branches, and said to him, you wanted to plant the garden of paradise on earth? You wanted to make this earth a paradisa? Well, here's your paradise, right? Again, paradisa, the word we use for paradise, comes from the ancient...
this reminds me of the Islamic stoning punishment. It's just as bad.
So, yeah, no, it was horrific. And Mazdak is subsequently, after he passes out at this site, he is then strung upside down and shot through with a barrage of arrows. He's put in front of a firing squad as he hangs upside down from a gallows. And then Khosrow goes and rounds up. Now, I'm getting this figure from Ferdowsi. Mm-hmm. And you don't have, because Ferdowsi describes this whole episode in the Shahnameh.
Yeah.
And we don't have alternative numbers for this. And
sure. I
find it ironic that whenever the partisans of Khosrow, the sort of right-wing, ultranationalist, pro-Sassanid Iranians these days, they call this number into question of how many Mazdakite leaders were rounded up by Khosrow and executed. They call this number into question, but then they don't doubt Ferdowsi on all kinds of other much more fantastical things. The Shahnameh is their Bible, which they swallow lock, stock, and barrel, and Ferdowsi is the great authority on everything else, except for when he tells us that Khosrow had 100,000 Mazdakite leaders executed. Not 100,000, riffraff or followers. The phrase he uses is, and 100,000 men and women of good standing, meaning the leaders. Yeah. So what movement was this that had just 100,000 leaders and, Lord knows how many millions of followers across the country? We know it was that kind of a mass movement and that deeply rooted, because despite the fact that these mass executions take place, and despite the fact that Khosrow goes on to carry out book burnings where he takes all of the the exegeses written by the Mazdakites, their own scriptures, and has them all consigned to flames, carries out book burnings, despite the fact that he wipes out their texts as far as we could tell, and he mass executes their leaders, this movement goes underground and it survives for another 300 years. Mm-hmm. And it takes the shape of what's called the Khurram Din movement or Khurram movement. And some people think that this is because Mazdak had a wife named Khurramiyah and that the movement was named after her. That's one hypothesis. Another hypothesis is that, in other words, that after the execution of Mazdak, she took the movement underground. And it got renamed as the Khurram Din. But some people think it just refers to the ideology of, joyousness and promoting verdant greenness and growth and so forth, Khurram Din. Mm-hmm. And in any case, it turns...
Abadi.
Huh?
Abadi.
Zendegi.
Abadi.
Zendegi and Abadi.
And Abadi.
Which is everything that Zarathustra's teaching was about, taking deserts and turning them into gardens using qanats or kannats and
transforming the world
into a paradise.
Yeah.
And so 200 years, 250 years or so, almost 300 years after the Arab invasion and occupation of Iran by the Caliphate, the single most powerful resistance movement to the Caliphate, the spearhead of Iranian insurgency against the Arabian Caliphate in Baghdad, was this movement. It comes out of the woodwork in the mountains of Azerbaijan and in the area around the Caspian Sea, in particular, in Hyrcania, Greater Hyrcanian Forest. This movement comes out of the woodwork, and it's led by a young man whose name was Hassan. He was a Shiite, and he was a delivery boy for a certain feudal lord called Javedan. So this guy Javedan in Iranian Azerbaijan, in the mountains of that area, and his wife take in this delivery boy, which, and I found it funny in a previous conversation of ours, you referred to him as the grocery clerk.
No, that was a reference.
Apocalypse Now, which, you know, Apocalypse Now, Martin Sheen.
Exactly what it was a reference to. No, that's what the reference.
You're just a grocery clerk.
You're an errand boy for grocery clerks,
exactly,
sent to collect a bill. I think I'm paraphrasing it, but you know.
No, I think that you got it almost. You got every word of that. Yeah. My favorite film, Apocalypse Now.
Wow.
So
another connection, Jason.
Yeah. So to speak of the real Apocalypse Now, this is what happens with this.
The
guy.
real Apocalypse Then.
The
Apocalypse Then. You're right.
Apocalypse Then is that this Hassan gets taken in by Javedan and his wife, and Javedan becomes his Ustad, his spiritual master, and initiates him into Mazdakism, and he takes the name Babak. He rejects his Arab name and takes the Persian name Babak. And so he absorbs the Mazdakite teaching, and then Javedan is killed in a joust in the snowy mountains of that region with some rival lord. And after the death of Javedan, interestingly, Babak marries the woman who had by then become his adopted mother. So presumably Javedan's wife was considerably younger than Javedan. That's fairly common. And when they take him in, he becomes like their adopted son, basically. And, you know, Babak has his own, the guy Hassan, who renames himself Babak, has his own mother and sisters who become significant later in the story. But he's taken in by Javedan and his wife, and so this woman is like his stepmother, sort of, but then he marries her after Javedan is killed. And in their wedding ceremony, she says, according to the records of that ceremony, that Babak's mission is the restoration of the religion of Mazdak. She explicitly says that. And the wedding ceremony takes place on the flayed skin of a cow, which is a Mithraic symbol.
Jason, a couple of quick pop culture references on this front, since you brought up, let me put you on mute for one. References, you mentioned Apocalypse Now. I've always wondered if that last scene in Apocalypse Now, where they slaughter that bull, has some connection to Mithraism and Mithra's slaying of the bull. And also, I wanted to mention earlier when we were talking about the Zoroastrian revolution and how it was truly perhaps history's first both political and more deeply philosophical revolution, reminds me of another scene from another, what I would call a Gnostic film, because it's based on a Philip K. Dick novel, Blade Runner, where Rutger Hauer goes after his maker, finds him, and puts out his eyes and kills him. And I always sort of intuitively, even when I saw that as a teenager, saw that as that's God. And that's us doing that to God for having limited humankind in the way that Rutger Hauer was limited in his lifetime, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
I know you're a film fan yourself, so.
Yeah, I mean, what people don't understand, the cinephiles who appreciate some of the more Gnostic or even satanic elements of these films don't understand is that these are actually Iranian ideas in origin. If
they're Gnostic ideas, and to the extent that Gnosis goes back to Mithraism and all that, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, so we've got this this Blade Runner up there, this this errand boy who's become
grocery clerk collecting
yes.
a bill.
And he is initiated by Javedan and then by Javedan's wife, who becomes his wife, as the leader of the Mazdakite movement. And he starts waging an absolutely brutal, merciless campaign against the caliphate. Babak goes to the extent of, and we still have ruins of his castle. He had more than one fortress.
That's right. Yeah.
By John. It's actually a fairly popular tourist site in northwestern Iran. And so he had all these fortresses, and he started going on this campaign, frankly, of terror, where he cracked down on all the Iranians who had made deals with the caliphate. And so now this is a very important point that also needs to be made. A lot of the Orthodox Zoroastrians went in with the caliphate in order to preserve their feudal lands and retain control of their property. A lot of the Orthodox Zoroastrians, the Vehdin people, basically gave their allegiance to the caliphate. Okay, they signed on the dotted line and accepted the authority of Baghdad. And so Babak, okay, so let's just get it into the heads of some of these, neo-Zoroastrian nationalists, that Zoroastrians, in the Orthodox sense, did not save Iran from the caliphate. They signed up with the caliphate.
Wow.
The poor and downtrodden of Iran, who were apparently still Mazdakites, because Mazdakism comes back out of the woodwork with a vengeance under Babak, they're the ones who fought the caliphate. So it's the heretics who were executed by Khosrow who then try to save Iran from the Arab Muslim caliphate, not the Orthodox Zoroastrians. So what does Babak do? Babak engages in a campaign of terror against Iranians who have betrayed the country and have made deals with the caliphate. And some of these feudal lords try to take their sons and their daughters, in particular their daughters and their wives, and send them away to convents where they presumably will be protected from the wrath of Babak. Well, what does Babak do? He sets fire to these convents and he immolates these women and children. Wow. And scaled to the population of today, if you were to take the number of Iranians, many tens and tens of thousands of Iranians that were killed by Babak, according to the records of the time, and scale it up per the percentage of population today, the man was responsible for killing a few million of his fellow Iranians in order to resist the caliphate, which is another thing that ought to be remembered by Iranian nationalists who claim the banner of Babak Khorramdin. That's the length to which he went to fight Arab Islam, okay? So eventually, as you might predict, he was betrayed, captured, and arrested. Actually, he was involved with these two insurgents in the HYRCANIA region around the Caspian, Afshin and Mazyar. Afshin and Mazyar were two other insurgents who also came from Parthian backgrounds. And something that I neglected to mention when I was talking about Kavad and Mazdak and the whole Mazdakite revolution was that you have to consider that this Mazdakite revolution was as successful as it was over the course of an entire generation only because it must have had the backing of some of the Parthian lords who had been sidelined by the Sassanids. They had to have had
noble houses.
Mazdak and Kavad had to have had some backing from Parthian noble houses for them to have been as successful as they were. And so then when Babak is in charge of the Mazdakite movement, which has become the Khorramdin movement, it's these same Parthian nobles in the Caspian region in HYRCANIA who start working with him, Afshin and Mazyar. But then he's ultimately betrayed by one of them. I think Afshin tries for a long time to, he's kind of he's a double agent that's playing a real complex long game with the caliphate, and he tries for a long time to not in earnest move against Babak and gives Babak a lot of opportunities to escape. But tragically, in the course of that, Babak is ultimately he winds up being captured by some Armenian prince and handed over to the caliphate. And anyway, he's executed in Samarra by the Islamic Caliphate, has his arm severed, and remains defiant as his blood is spraying across his face, at the gallows, basically. And so Babak is executed and defeated, and then, shortly thereafter, throughout the course of the 800s, these two other fellows, Afshin and Mazyar, both wind up moving against the caliphate as well, and their revolts are ultimately defeated in like the 840s, late 830s into the 840s. But they're able to shatter the power of the caliphate over Iran to the extent that within, let's say, 50 years, the Buyids in that same area, Al Buyid, the Buyid family, essentially asserts regional autonomy and then starts gaining ground against the caliphate. And then by like the end of the 900s, the Buyids have reduced the Baghdad caliphate to being their own vassal. And this is when you have the great flourishing of the arts and sciences and technology.
The so-called Islamic Golden Age.
So-called Islamic Golden Age. So my point in terms of historical dialectics,
led by not just non-Muslims, but anti-Muslims.
Radically, read Razi, the writings of Razi. Razi just trashes the Quran. He's he levels scathing secularist critiques at these clerics and from his point of view, preposterous beliefs and edicts that you find in the Quran.
I've read that even Avicenna, toward the end of his life, wrote that he basically had to hide the fact that he was not a Muslim.
Yes, that was later. And that was when the Turks were starting to come in, and this Islamic repression started to basically cripple this incipient Renaissance or Enlightenment that was taking place in Iran. But my point is that Iranian Renaissance would never have taken place but for the Mazdakite resurgence led by Babak, but for the Khurramdin movement, which shattered ultimately the power of the caliphate. And so, look, just try to wrap your mind around the historical scope here. When Mazdak took over the Sassanid state as prime minister, his movement was already 300 years old. After this massacre of Mazdakite leaders by Khosrow and, the attempted book burnings and so on and so forth, and the movement going underground, it manages to survive for another 300 years to reemerge as the spearhead of resistance to the caliphate, and ultimately the force that does shatter the power of the caliphate and allow for an Iranian Renaissance to take place. Now, look, the entire history of the United States is barely 300 years.
It's not even. Yeah.
Okay, the entire history of the United States. What movement is this that for 600 years was the motor of Iranian history? 300 years before Islam, 300 years after Islam. Its first target is Zoroastrian orthodoxy. Its second target is Islamic legalism.
Well, I assume that you and I would agree that this continued even later with the Hassan al-Sabah and Omar Khayyam and the three friends and the cult of the Hashishin or assassins, so on and so forth. And you and I have talked about this offline very briefly, but maybe even can be said to have sparked the Safavid revolution, and all the way till now. I'll tell a brief story that I mentioned to you, but I want to say it to our combined audience here, that when I was a teenager in Dallas, my father belonged to a opposition group. I think it was called Anjuman, basically a monarchist group of Iranian American exiles. And I was just a kid, so we were at the kids' table, I always say. But one moment that really sticks in my mind was in the committee was a well-known Sufi, and I was very surprised because at the time, at that age, I was reading about Sufism for the first time in the works of Idris Shah and so on and so forth, and I was actually quite surprised that at a nationalist, monarchist type of meeting that there would be a Sufi who certainly you have to say is a religious person, even though not an orthodox one. And someone said something sort of derisive about Sufism in front of him, about the notion that what have you done for us, or what have you done for us lately? That basically the insinuation was that you're a useless movement. And he said something back that still sticks in my head to this day, very eloquently, and I'm just paraphrasing it here, but the notion that if it were not for the Sufis, and by the way, when I say Sufis, I think you and I both agree that it's really a continuation of this same Mazdakite, Zoroastrian, Manichaean movement under the guise of Islam, because it had to cover itself and pretend that it's Islamic so as not to be considered even more of a heresy than it was. He said if it was not for the Sufis, there would be no Iran today. And I think he was saying directly what you are arguing for here academically.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of nuances here, right? So you're absolutely correct that Shah Ismail Safavi was a Sufi, quote unquote, but in the sense that he was initiated in the, Jangal Mazandaran. He was initiated in the Iranian forest by people who were remnants of this Khurramdin movement. And so Shah Ismail Safavi, I very much agree with you, was in the same trajectory as Hassan Sabbah, the leader of the Order of Assassins, the Nizari Ismailis, and that these Nizari Ismailis themselves were the last gasp of the Khurramdin, or of Mazdakism, after the Turks and the Mongols had come in and taken over the ruins of the Baghdad Caliphate and reimposed Islam in a very litigious and orthodox Sunni form on Iran. And so then this whole Shiite discourse was adopted by these Khurramdinan, these Mazdakites, in order to drive a wedge between and within the Muslims, right? To divide them against themselves and to preserve these teachings under an exoteric Muslim garb, but with a view ultimately to dispensing with that exoteric facade and revealing yet again the esoteric message, which is of course what Hassan did at Alamut when he basically said, listen, the Qiyamat has come, the end of history is here, and nothing is true and everything is permitted, and actually
nothing is forbidden.
Actually passed edicts to execute anyone who follows Sharia law. Anyone who follows Shariat was supposed to be executed. This is the level of antinomian mysticism that was going on in Alamut before the Mongols came in and disassembled that fortress brick for brick. So anyway, yes, there's this undercurrent that survives through Sufism, and then Shah Ismail Safavi, who is a representative of that and some kind of a genius who at age 15 was writing this insane poetry, and go read it. I am Zahak and I am Iskandar. It's insane. Anyway, and he does save the territorial integrity of Iran, and he reframes Iranian national cohesion against the Ottoman Sunni Caliphate by institutionalization. But of course, that comes back to bite him in the ass, because then 200-300 years later, it's a different kind of Shiism, propagated by Ayatollahs that starts taking over the Safavid state.
Yeah, see, this is why everything needs to be understood in the context of the time. Otherwise, it's so easily misunderstood.
That could be a whole conversation in itself of, Sufism and the assassins and Shah Ismail. But the point I simply want to make here in terms of what's going on in Iran right now is that you cannot disregard a movement that for 600 years, both before and after Islam, was the motor of Iranian sociopolitics. Okay, that is what Mazdakism or the Khurramdin was. And so I'm not saying that the majority of young people, and it's important to emphasize that a lot of the people being arrested, being executed right now are 15, 16, 17 years old. They're under 18 years of age, and they're not even the same generation that was in the Green Movement, let alone the, let alone
79 revolution, yeah.
79 revolution. These kids are radical. They are not interested in some kind of Zoroastrian orthodoxy being the state religion of a new Iran.
Radical in the sense of the true sense of the word, meaning going back to the root, right?
Yeah. And they're very inspired by Zarathustra. They're reconnecting with the message of Zarathustra, but they're also into death metal and don't mind framing themselves as Satanists in a lot of cases. And so this is a very, eclectic countercultural spirit that prevails among this generation. And I don't think that it's at all incidental, that it's the same spirit as that of the Mazdakite revolution.
Not at all.
I think that if you look at this whole long arc of history that we've been laying out here in terms of Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, right? One of the main concepts of the Swiss-German psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, that there is a collective unconscious, like the Freudian personal unconscious. There's an unconscious that's collective to an entire society or a country. And Jung had, going into the Second World War, Jung had noted in the 1930s that the archetype of Wotan, Odin, Wotan, had reemerged. He noticed it had reemerged in the collective unconscious of the Germans, and he was worried about how it might lead to a war. Okay, so Jung saw that coming. And I think that the same dialectical forces that drove Iranian history for 600 years from, before Mazdak to the time of Babak Khorramdin, those forces are now reaching their dialectical culmination in this movement of Zan Zendegi Azadi. And that we need to look at this situation in those terms, in terms of the idea of the collective unconscious, and in terms of the power of what Jung called synchronicity, for events to be events in our, physical, observable, experiential world to be organized in a way that reflects deeper forces of the collective unconscious, right? I think that we need to look at the situation in Iran in those terms as well.
I absolutely agree. I not to sound too much like Dr. Pangloss from Voltaire's Candide, who thought that everything is for the best. But in this particular case, I wonder if it was not historically necessary for the 1979 revolution to happen, for this kind of reaction to it from the bottom up, rather than what the Pahlavis tried to do, which was to force Westernization, and sometimes in the most crass way from the top down. This kind of more genuine, more organic reaction to occur. And again, I'm not saying Pangloss like that. That it's good that the revolution happened. Certainly, I could list it would fill an encyclopedia the sort of negative historical occurrences that happened because of the revolution, you could say. I can argue that, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan might not have happened. Then the Mujahideen wouldn't have come into existence. They wouldn't have morphed into the Taliban. They wouldn't have morphed into Al-Qaeda and then ISIS. There may not have been an Iran-Iraq war. There may not have been a Desert Shield and a Desert Storm and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, from the perspective of Iranian civilization, I still wonder if it was not maybe historically necessary for this to occur.
I couldn't agree more. Okay, I could not agree more. But this is also why it's very important how this revolution ends, where it ends up, in other words, right? Because if you want to justify 40 some odd years of Islamic theocratic tyranny over the country as a learning process, right? As a dialectical developmental process, better have been worth it.
It better have, because it better get somewhere. Otherwise, it's
exactly.
a complete disaster.
So secular liberal democracy should not be the outcome of this revolution. Iran is not here to provide the world with France 2.0, right? I mean, the French
or another woke movement, in the worst sense of that term,
The French Revolution was France's the French revolutions, the first one, the second one in the 1800s and so forth, were France's contribution to the march of liberty and progress in the world that followed from the dialectical forces intrinsic to the French collective unconscious and its role in European history. Iran has its own dialectical historical forces. They're different. Frankly, they're older and a lot deeper. And they're still at play in what's going on the streets right now in Iran and in the deepest aspirations or highest aspirations of the youth. And so I think that those forces need to be allowed to reach their own culmination. So when you have people like Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi giving interviews where he says, oh, this Islamic regime was actually good for us because, as Ahmad Kasravi said back in the day, the Ayatollahs are the best people to teach us the value of secularism. Well, excuse me, Reza Pahlavi. But first of all, read Ahmad Kasravi and other secular intellectuals of that era a little more carefully before you say that criticizing Islam is going to be outlawed by the future regime as hate speech. I mean, this is the position that he's taken. And a lot of people around him as well in the so-called opposition to this regime are saying that we should have a woke, liberal, democratic.
Yeah, it drives me crazy it drives me crazy when I hear this, because you're talking about a religion, and I say Islam. I don't mince words and say Islamist. I say Islam itself. How can you commit hate speech against a religion that believes that if you don't believe in its doctrine, or in the hallucinations of a 7th century Bedouin from Arabia, that you're going to burn in hell forever? Is that not hateful, right? Forever. And if you're born into it and you choose to leave that religion, it's apostasy. They can kill you, right? So to point that out is hate speech, but that doctrine isn't hate speech. This is an inversion of all rationality. It's liberal, well-meaning people in the West trying to hold the position that let's all get along and all religions are equal. No, they're not. And there's people like Reza Aslan on there, and I'm not one of these Reza Aslan haters, by the way. I actually like the guy, but who are defenders of religion in that sense, and say, well, religion depends on the person and the person's mood at the time, and if a person is in an angry mood, that they're going to interpret it one way. If the person is in a happy mood, all that may be well and good, but there are differences in doctrine. Islam is not, unlike Christianity, which at least has the clause in it that render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto Christ what is Christ. Islam doesn't have that. Islam is definitionally, and I say this word, I think, with some forethought, a totalitarian religion. And so the whole notion that pointing that out is hate speech is, to me, turning the world upside down. It's liberals trying to be tolerant, but how can you be tolerant with an ideology that in and of itself definitionally is intolerant?
Absolutely. And if people want to see a really rigorous but concise argument for this, I don't even want to call it view of Islam, this exposition of it, this exposition of Islam, this exposure of Islam as a totally tyrannical, totalitarian, theocratic, legal, and political order, not just a faith. Look at my essay in my book, Lovers of Sophia, my anthology, Lovers of Sophia. There's an essay called A Critique of Shiite Esotericism, where I lay this out, in great detail with citing chapter and verse of the Quran and Hadith and so on.
From the source itself. Yeah,
from the source. Yeah. So look, my point is this, that these people like, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi and other so-called, most of them aren't even intellectuals in any sense who are in this so-called opposition to the Islamic.
Putting it diplomatically.
They're brainwashed by Western woke discourse, which frankly has ruined the West.
It's ruined the West. And you see, there's a counter to that with, There's a reaction happening in the West against the woke ideology here.
Yes.
So by the time they take it on, it may be already dead in the West.
It will be, and not only will it be, I'm going to make this prediction right now, is that the reaction won't go well either. And the West is going to collapse. The West is going to collapse. It's going to be in a state of horrendous civil strife. And it shouldn't be Iranians copying a failed Western model. It should be Iranians of tomorrow teaching the West how to reconstruct itself.
Yeah, a woke ideology that's already being imploded by the likes of Jordan Peterson and on, you know.
Right. And so, look, I think that the revolution of women, life, and freedom needs to ultimately reach a culmination that allows for the historical forces that flared up in the Mazdakite revolution and then in the insurgency of Babak Khurramdin against the caliphate, that allows those historical forces to bring about a form of society that could be even the salvation of the West, right? And the last thing we should do is to basically be satisfied with a parliamentary democracy of the type that the constitutionalists were looking for in 1906 or whatever.
One that very quickly will be taken over by special interests and all the rest that's happened here.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what's going on in Iran is not just a secular revolution, it's a spiritual revolution.
Spiritual,
and it is the outcome of a revolutionary spirit that's been at work defining the history and destiny of the country for, you know, a couple of thousand years, since, you know, the followers of Zardusht of Pars tried to take Zoroastrianism back from Babak, right? Yeah. And so over my dead body are apologists for Ardashir Babakan going to be the ones who determine the future of Iran. Neither them nor, on the other hand, a bunch of brainwashed disciples of Western wokeism.
Yeah.
I mean, these are both false alternatives for Iran's future. They're not true to the real scope of Iran's revolutionary history and the depth of the forces that have been at play there.
Yeah, no, we're in completely agreement here. And of course, it requires that these young people that you were talking about, who perhaps embody this spiritual, historical movement, whether consciously or unconsciously, actually become more conscious of the real history, right?
Absolutely.
And this is why I find your work so important, because they already feel it. It's in there, whether you want to call it epigenetics or whatever the case may be, or spiritual.
Archetypal psychology.
Archetypal psychology. But I think it also requires something more. It requires them to actually read the history, and not just superficial histories, but the level of historicity that you are bringing to the picture here. You have to read the original documents, and not everyone needs to understand it at that level, of course, but a certain number of leadership cadre are enough to push a culture a certain direction. I don't think there's ever been a time in history where the entire population understood, fully the ethos of that civilization that they live in.
No, all of the great revolutions in history, great changes in societies have been brought about by a dedicated, focused minority. Always. This was true of the French Revolution. It was true of every major transformation, the American Revolution. And by the way, since I mentioned the American Revolution, let me just make a little note about this interesting book,
Sure.
Return of the Revolutionaries, where now I don't know whether the argument of this book is true or not. I really haven't dug into it empirically, but the guy is a researcher who, basing himself on empirical studies of reincarnation that were done by people like Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. And let's remember, the Mazdakites believed in reincarnation. He argues that the leaders of the counterculture in 60s America, 60s into the 70s, whatever, were the reincarnation of the generation of the founders of the country. And he identifies specific people as having been like Thomas Jefferson, Tom Paine, et cetera, so on and so forth. And so, I don't know, I find this idea interesting. And
No, I love that concept because I see the 60s revolution, for all its faults and its silliness and all of that, to be a cultural flowering, a renaissance of American civilization.
Yeah, and so I wager that we are witnessing a return of the revolutionaries today in Iran.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, you will not execute us this time. It's not going to go down that way. You're not going to have Khosrow with his execution of 100,000 Mazdakite leaders, or Babak Khorramdin's forces being crushed by the caliphate. It won't have. We're going to win this time. We have fought long and hard, and this return of the revolutionaries will produce a true Iranian renaissance that can be a source of centuries of progress and innovation for all of humanity after, I think, what is going to be an imminent exhaustion of the West. I think the burden of progress and innovation in the world is going to go back to Iran, and that it's this revolutionary generation that's going to accept that responsibility.
At a time in history, as you have put it yourself, where we're an inch or two away from the coming technological singularity.
Exactly. And so that then, opens another future conversation
on
specifically the relationship between this revolution in Iran, the emphasis on science and innovation in the teaching of Zarathustra, and the forces that produced the great scientific technological golden age of the 900s to 1100s in Iran, right? And what relevance that may have to...
Which influenced the Renaissance, of course, in Italy.
Absolutely. And what relevance it may have to the role that Iran could play in the epoch after the fall, the no doubt at this point inevitable fall of the Islamic Republic. So I want to end on that note, but let me hand the floor back to you if there's any last comments, reflections that you have to share with our audience.
This has been a lovely conversation, Jason. I just I know that for every 5 minutes there's 10 minutes of thoughts that don't get to come out, so we'll have to do this again, I'm sure. But I've really appreciated the conversation. And as far as last comments, let me just say something along the lines, because you and I both have a little bit of an audience, you through your YouTube videos and me with the podcast and so on and so forth, a captive audience. So let me take this moment to sort of encourage our combined audience, to the extent that they have any respect for us, that whether you're a Persian or a Kurd or a Tajik or a Baluch or a Pashtun or a Tat or a Armenian, Assyrian, I won't go through if I'm leaving people out, Jew or Baha'i, whatever the case may be, please do not fall into the trap of thinking that you are not Iranian. If you love the humane, utopian, transformative vision of men and women using our own free conscious will to transform the world into Paradis or Paradisia or paradise, according to the ethics of good thoughts, good words, good deeds, to quote Zarathustra, into something, in the words of Omar Khayyam, closer to the heart's desire, then you are an Iranian. So don't let anyone tell you any different. Don't let anyone divide us from each other based on tribalism or the accident of modern national borders. The Islamic Revolution is dead, and long live the revolutionary spirit of Iran-Shah.
Amen to that. And cheers to what will be the first of many future conversations, Darius.
I look forward to it, Jason. It's an honor speaking with you, and I look forward to seeing the video in the next few days, hopefully.
Take care, my friend.
Take care.